The last panel takes the conversation forward. We've called it Evolving Traditions because, as we all know, these are not static traditions. They're constantly developing from all kinds of angles. And part of it is, of course, because they also involve performance. This is not just about drawing and painting and then sequestering these objects away in museum collections, but they have a life of their own because even the artists producing them have lives of their own as well in very specific contexts. We have three wonderful papers this afternoon, and we're going to start with Professor Frank Coram, who is a professor of religion and anthropology at Boston University. And his paper is entitled Singing Modernity, Bengal Potuas in a World of Globalization. And I think he has an absolutely phenomenal image on the screen. You can all see the crowded streets of Calcutta translated for us over here through all kinds of taxis. It doesn't have an ambassador car. I'm looking very close. That will come. Ah, wonderful, wonderful. So Frank's paper addresses the scroll paintings of Bengali Potuas or itinerant artists who have interacted with a variety of organizations, including NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, to disseminate information about health and hygiene, ecological issues, and gender equality as well, among other contemporary topics. And if you haven't visited the exhibition and seen Rani's work, she is somebody who's also working along these lines as well. So the story kind of continues in other parts of India as well. So welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Seeing as how we're running a little bit late, I think I'm going to go very quickly through the first part of the talk, which is introductory in nature. But I did want to sort of introduce those of you who aren't familiar with the tradition to the work of the Potuas, and then toward the end I'll come back to this idea of singing modernity. It's sort of the tentative title of the book I'm working on. I started it when I was a fellow at the Clark Art Institute, and it's starting to come together now after retranslating all of the songs, of which there are many. So as you heard, the Potuas are this they're an itinerant group, a cast, if you will, of painters, but they're also bards, so they sing songs about the scrolls they paint. Traditionally, they sang and painted about mythological themes, but they claim that they were modern before the concept of modernity existed. So I want to begin there, and then we'll work back to the title of this toward the end of the presentation. So who are these Potuas? Well, you know, as Professor Chakrabarty was telling us at the plenary lecture last evening, it's difficult to speculate when you jump centuries and sometimes millennia back to find obscure references in Vedic texts and bring them into the present by making analogies. So I want to avoid that kind of philological mistake and simply say that there were a lot of narrative painting traditions throughout India's history, but what the relationship between the Potuas, or as they're now known, Chitrakars, is to those other groups is still speculative and contested at best. Some people argue that it goes all the way back to references to the 2nd century BCE. That's not certain. However, we do know that they find a mention in a 13th century Sanskrit text written in Bengal known as the Brahma Vaivarta Purana. And there we are told that the Chitrakars are cast out of Hindu society for painting in an unorthodox fashion. It doesn't tell us anything more except that the Brahmins got mad at them and said, get out of here. So they were kicked out, and eventually they became Muslims. But they have their own version of who they are, as most castes do, and it begins with a story. Okay, and some of you may know this story. I know Pika knows it because she recorded and translated a version of it for an article she wrote for the Journal of Asian Studies. But it exists in multiple variations, but the motifs are pretty much stable all the way through. It begins with a demon or a Rakosh who is terrorizing the local population. After hibernating in the evenings, he comes out hungry in the morning. or the other, yes, in the morning he comes out and then he goes hunting and preys on little children, and you can see the mother weeping there as this demon steals and consumes the child. So then the men of the village got together and they tried to come up with a plan to bring an end to this terror that was haunting the village. And the fellow in the center there, and if you can notice the iconography, it remains fairly constant, as I'll point out, in different scrolls that are being done by this community. So the fellow in the middle is known as the wise one. It says, let's construct a mirror and put it out in front of the demon's cave, and when he comes out in the morning, he'll see it. So he gets up kind of groggy in the morning, and he walks out, and he sees his reflection in the mirror and says, what's this? Another monster? Another demon? So he starts boxing with the mirror, and he breaks it, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces. And then he says, oh my gosh, I can never defeat so many demons, such as myself, and therefore he becomes kind of overwhelmed and commits suicide. Throws in the towel, and there he is after he does himself in. And then the men of the village come and they say, great, we've solved the problem. Now how are we going to communicate this to the people? So they said, let's paint a scroll, as you can see down there at the bottom, and we'll go around from village to village and we'll recount this incident so that people won't have to be afraid anymore. And after time, as Guru Parachitrakar, who told me this story first, said, people got bored of hearing the same story over and over again. So they said, can't you tell us other stories? And they said, well, what would you like to hear? And then they said, how about something about Sita and Rama? Or how about something from the Mahabharata and so forth? And so their repertoire started expanding. But the point is that, they claim that this story that they tell about their origins is really kind of like a journalistic account or an ethnographic account, if you will, of how they came into existence as a caste, right? And so this is their caste occupation. And that's what they mean when they say we were modern before modernity. The idea that, they weren't just doing these mythological scrolls, painting these mythological scrolls and composing songs about those scrolls, but they were already reporting on contemporary events back at the beginning of their origin, right? And this is something we'll come back to later. But by and large, as they come down to us in history, they are known as being painters of mythological stories. So presumably the reason they got kicked out of the caste system in the Brahmavaivarta Purana was because of their low caste status, and they painted unorthodoxly, and gradually they eventually became Muslims, as Guru Parachitrakar here is. Now his name sounds very Hindu, but they all have two names. They have one Muslim name and one Hindu name. So when they're amongst Muslims, they use their Muslim name. When they're amongst Hindus, they use their Hindu names. But by and large, their patronage base is in the Hindu community. So when they sing these songs, these mythological songs, they're being patronized by Hindus. So let me just quickly give you sort of a little bit of the geographical context. They're from a village called Noya, what I called the Village of Painters in my 2006 book and exhibition, and Pingla Thana, Medinipur District, West Bengal. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography, we're talking a little bit 90 kilometers south of Calcutta there in Pingla Thana, Pingla Police Station, and right about in the middle of the Thana is on the main road is where you come to Noya. And Noya is this very small place which lies on two sides of this asphalt road. One side you have a majority of Hindus living, and on the other side you have a majority of Muslims living. And in the middle, you also have a lot of cows residing there. And it's a rice subsistence agricultural base. And in the middle of this area, between the majority Muslim and the majority Hindu area of the village, you have what is known as the Portua Para, or the Portua neighborhood. And this was the entrance in 2001 to the village, which is when I first started doing, to the Para, when I first started doing research there. And this is sort of the interior to give you a sense of what the interior of the painting neighborhood looked like. Basically, you know, your typical adobe homes with thatched roofs, a small garden attached usually. As more prosperity and wealth is coming into the community, the thatch is being replaced by tin and aluminum. People are starting to buy up a little bit more land. Most of them are landless. But here basically is the way that the village is laid out. And as in the former picture I showed you, this is one of the entrances. So the first people you encounter are in this front row. And I'll just say that these are the ones who have been most successfully internationally in terms of marketing their goods. So just throw that out there now. And some of these people who helped me are Dukusham, Gurupara, Monusham, Sundar, Sharno, and Monimala. This was originally predominantly a male occupation because it required often going away from home for long periods of time and wandering from village to village. Women helped in various capacities preparing the scrolls and so forth, as we'll see later on. But then in the 70s, there's a significant change. This is kind of a complex chart of their patterns of endogamy. They marry primarily within the community, but then recently some have been marrying their daughters out into more Orthodox Muslim families. And that has had somewhat of an impact on the community as well. This is Dukusham. He is the guru of the village, as he's called. He taught most of the younger people in the village how to sing. He has quite an extensive repertoire. And in fact, we were talking earlier today about this idea of the single artist as opposed to sort of the Garkhana model in Bengal, that is the factory model, where you have the master and then the disciples who are doing little aspects of a scroll, and then he's just the overseer who then signs off on it when it's done. Well, he has a lot of sons, and his sons are the ones who do most of the work nowadays. He rarely paints himself, but his power is in the knowledge that he has of the songs. And so everyone else in the village only knows about half of his repertoire, and so he asked me to record his entire repertoire, and so that's what I did for posterity's sake. Now all the younger people are learning to read so that they can come up with their own songbooks, such as Gurupada here, and then use that as a basis for expanding the tradition. Most of the Portuguese are non-literate, and so it's an oral medium in which they compose, especially among the women. But Gurupada can read, as you can see here and right. His cousin Monu, and this fellow here is the one who collaborated with the professor Flowers, yes, who will be speaking tomorrow here at Syracuse on the book about Martin Luther King, which is in the gift shop over there. And Monu is also one of the first guys to paint a 9/11 scroll called the Oil Trade Center. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But then, and here is another person whose picture is in the under the banyan tree catalog in the Aditinath Sarkar article, if any of you took a moment to look at that. Shorno is Monu's sister. She doesn't read, but she composes orally, then he writes it down for her, and they travel together. Her husband stays home and takes care of the children while she goes out and helps provide monetarily for the family. And she's now a rising artist in Calcutta because she has patronage from a posh gallery there in the city. And she was also one of the two artists who accompanied me to the United States for my show in 2006 in New Mexico. Then other women, Monimala here, teaching her daughter how to sing a narrative about Chottopir, a Sufi saint well known in eastern India, and now well known to the English reading literati through the translations of Tony Stewart at Vanderbilt. And here you have 3 generations of Portugal women. Rani, the grandmother, who was the first to do an HIV/AIDS scroll for the American Center. If you read Aditinath's article, you know that. Her daughter, and then her granddaughter there. The granddaughter now this was about 10 years ago, so the granddaughter now is already painting and becoming part of the tradition as well. Just very quickly, the scrolls are made by sewing together sheets of readily available poster paper with cotton thread. Paints used to be primarily botanical and mineral, but they shifted over into synthetic paints a long time ago, but since they've been kind of reinventing the tradition since the 1970s, they've been going back. And if we want to talk about performing workshops, this is what they do. They make organic paints for the public so that the public thinks that they have this sort of traditional way of doing things, but most of the time they use acrylics and other kinds of paints, especially when they paint on non-traditional media, as I'll show later, like T-shirts and various things like that. But traditionally, this was how it was done. These things are all collected locally in the village. Shorkar writes about them in that article and under the banyan tree. And they're made in large quantities that are stored in various jars and so forth, and then are used year-round. Borders are created. The rough work is added in. The fine work is then completes it, and then old sari material is usually put onto the back, and these are then hung out in the sun to dry. And then they would be used, they would be stuffed in these sacks that would be carried around by the painters from place to place where they would sing songs for a public, right? So the main point here is that the tradition was originally a performative one where the scrolls were only props. They were props that were used for the singing tradition. But what has happened recently, since the 70s, is that there's been a reversal. The singing tradition has been downplayed, and the scrolls have now become objects of art, right? In other words, they've become fetishized in a sense, and the value resides in the paintings rather than in the performative tradition. So there are pros and cons to that, and we can come back to that later. Themes, the old mythic ones, the Puranic ones, draw, as I said, from the epics. Here's a chapter from the Sita Haran, Ram kidnapping Sita, Jatayu trying to rescue her, Ravana revealing himself. Then you have the Durga story from the Chondi Mongol, a vernacular medieval Bengali text. You have the birth of Ganesh here, Shiva cutting off the head and replacing it then with an elephant one. Monasha, Bengali goddess. So you have vernacular mythology as well as episodes taken from classical Sanskrit mythology, but also from vernacular versions. One scholar at Jadavpur University refers to them as apocryphal stories based on classical stories. And I don't want to get into that dichotomy too much between classical and folk. In any case, you also have Muslim scrolls, as I said here. This is another one about a popular Sufi pir in West Bengal and the punishments that one receives for not remembering and revering these various saints. And the point here is that both Hindus and Muslims worship Shotto Pir and Gaji Pir and so on, and in the form of different roop or form, and also different names. So Shotto Pir is Shotto Narayan for Hindus, right? Now, of course, they also have Christian clients, so here are the Stations of the Cross done. This is a relatively recent motif that they've been doing. But more recently, they've been starting to paint these shamajik or social scrolls. Here's one from the colonial era of a local freedom fighter who pays the ultimate price of death for sedition. Here he's being hung by the British. You have the theme of the ill effects of modernity, if you will. This one is called Shadhinota, Independence, 1947. And it's about the spoiled daughter-in-law who you see there languishing over here. And the mother-in-law, the Burni, is in the threshing room doing all the work. And it ends by the daughter-in-law saying, well, if you don't buy me spectacles, soap, and shoes, I'll leave you and find another. She's speaking to her husband there. So that's taken as being kind of a negative effect of modernity resulting from colonial or European culture. You also have a lot of them, as Romika mentioned, that deal with medical issues. Here's one about taking care of your children, getting them inoculated so they don't get smallpox, so on and so forth. You have dowry death as a theme. You have ecological themes about taking care of trees, brikoropon, and planting new ones. You have political commentaries. This is about the flood and the Medinipur flood of 1972. And then you have here Mother Teresa's funeral with all the Bhadralok of Calcutta coming out there and paying homage to her. The gentlemen all are wearing glasses there. That's what makes them intellectuals. And then you have here again a scene from a scroll called Talkies about cinema, where boys and girls get together and in the dark when the film is being shown and do things that they shouldn't ought to do, like hold hands in public and so forth. And then, of course, the inevitable AIDS scroll that Rani Chitrikar first painted and is now fairly prevalent in the repertoire of all of the painters in the community. You have ones about communal harmony and disharmony. This one is about the Babri Masjid, and there's a full translation of this in my book. But essentially it says, it uses the Cain and Abel story to argue that Cain represents the Muslims and Abel represents the Hindus, and we're all children of one offspring. Akmaya Shontan is the refrain. So they're of course trying to call for harmony rather than disharmony and violence. Then they have what they call the Notun or new themes. Here's the Titanic. You all know the story. This one is by Charno, the woman I showed you earlier. She never saw the film herself, but people in the city had told her what the basic plot was. And on the basis of that, she did this. And you see Leo and Kate dancing up there and then doing a few other things down below there. And in her mind, in Charno's mind, this was the reason that the ship sank. That is to say, it's the Kali Yuga, right? And so people are performing things, are sinning, and therefore it was inevitable that this ship should go down, right? So this is a point I want you to keep in mind when I get to my conclusion. The idea similar to the Rhode Island furniture maker who says, I give them what they want, but on my own terms, right? So it's a kind of what we might want to call, although it's cliche to say so nowadays, an alternative form of modernity. Modernity on their own terms. Ajab Ghatana is another one of their themes. Here is the Porashi Biplab, the French Revolution. You see the beheading there. Atom bomb, another one from a children's textbook. Here's the death of Indira Gandhi at the hands of her 2 Sikh bodyguards. And finally, 9/11. And this one is called America Jolce, America is Burning. And it actually originates in December of 2001, which is when I began my field work there. And it was then that a jatra, or itinerant folk performing troupe, passed through Noya, and they did a sensational performance about 9 hours long called America Jolce, right? And next morning, everyone got up. They were inspired by that. I mean, it was really fantastic. There were 3 stages. On one stage was George Bush. On another stage was Tora Bora. And in the middle was bin Laden. And it showed the whole thing with wooden cardboard airplanes coming down on wires and then crashing into these twin towers that they had built in this fallow rice field. And so the next day, I went back to the Portuapara, and they started, 3 people started painting these 9/11 scrolls, which then became very, very popular, especially amongst tourists. So that's an important factor that I'll come back to later. And that then gave birth to the Afghan war scroll. So here we see the Northern Alliance fighting with the Taliban. And then finally, bin Laden fleeing and escaping to Tora Bora. Okay, new context, I already mentioned the cinema, the talkies, people coming using all modes of transportation to see the latest film. mixing styles. Here we see a kind of hybrid style incorporating a little bit of, oh wow, a little bit of Madhubani, but also Kalighat and so forth. I got to move really fast because I got the 5-minute warning. Okay, I can't really get into the history. There is a Portua Para in Calcutta around the Kalighat area, and you see here Shilpi Gopal Pal's Chitrakar's workshop. And so there are Hindu Chitrakars as well who take the name Pal, and most of them are engaged in the work of making murtis for Durga Puja and things like that. Here's one from that area. It says Noshto Koriben, don't pee here, but it's a Disney kind of thing. But you also see Sri Ramakrishna there and Sharada Devi and all the deities in one kind of interesting montage. And this is really remarkable. An entire house used as a canvas for Durga Puja, and the pandal then sloped off of the roof. And so once the puja was done, threw away everything else, but they kept the painting of the house. So this is I'm moving now into alternative forms of work that they do. They obviously can't make a living just from the scrolls anymore because cinema and other things like that have pretty much taken over the entertainment market. So they come to these handicraft fairs, such as this one in Calcutta, where they set up shop basically, and as you can see, they're not really selling very much. They're just kind of hanging out there, mass producing these scrolls for sale, but not really selling too many. And here you see an example of that factory type thing where the father and the mother are there basically to talk to people walking by, and the children are doing a lot of the work, and that's how they get started in the tradition. And then they were encroaching on these guys here trying to sell the hair remedy. It didn't work, I tried it, but then you have more of these guys. And then we come finally to the theme of globalization and the Portuas in a world of globalization. Something significant happened in 2010. I started my work in 2001 and essentially spent a lot of time there between 2001 and 2006 when I published this book, Village of Painters, and did an exhibit by the same title. In 2010, however, a group called banglanatok.com, and they have a very flashy website you can go to, received a huge grant. This is a guy who became very successful in the Silicon Valley, a Bengali, but then decided to give it all up and go home and do something for his people, that is the Bengalis. But they've also spread out now into some of the contiguous areas. And they got a huge grant from the European Union called Ethnomagic Going Global. And this then allowed them to try and use the work of the Portuas as a marketing scheme. So they built this community center so that everyone could display their wares. That way it would be guaranteed that not just the people in the front of the village would get patronage from foreigners, but the people in the back of the village as well. So to do this, they created something called Part Maya, or the kind of, the magic of Maya in the sense of magic and not illusion, although it is kind of illusory when you think about it. The magic of the scroll. And what they did, I call it kind of Disneyfication, because now they never used to paint their walls like you see here, unlike in the Madhubani tradition, but their patron at Banglanatok said you should do this, so everyone started painting their houses. And then once a year now, they have a weekend thing called Part Maya, where everyone puts out their wares. They do painting workshops and things of that sort. And more and more new themes have been emerging as a result. Here is a picture of MLK from the Martin Luther King story. There's the Ku Klux Klan there. Professor Flowers will tell you a lot more about it tomorrow. But Monu had done this one for the 2010 inaugural Part Maya festival that they had there. And younger people such as Phoebe here, who was just a child when we started, are now budding artists themselves. And here he is painting one about Shingur. Shingur is a place where there was a peasant rebellion against the government, the former CPIM, about building a Tata car factory here, and eventually they pushed the Tatas out, and I think they went to Gujarat and built it there, but it was a peasant victory. And when I asked Pobi in 2008 why he hadn't ever painted a Schindler scroll, he said, Dada, you can't tell a story without an ending. And so he waited, or brother, you can't tell a story until you have an ending. So he waited until 2010 when the whole issue was resolved, and then came up with this. This, by the way, is on the cover of my most recent book, Anthropology of Performance, which came out last year. And then as a consequence of this, more and more day trippers have been coming in, both Bengali and foreign, taking a lot of pictures, filming. Here's Rani, the HIV/AIDS singer. But they complain that these people come, they gawk, they take pictures, they leave their garbage behind, but they're not buying any scrolls. And of course, anthropologists contribute to this as well. Here we see Claudio, an anthropologist from Brazil, who came to commission them to illustrate his doctoral dissertation, which was on Portuguese slavery in Goa. So this was a kind of experiment where he taught them about the history of Goa, and then they made scrolls out of that for him to use. And he ultimately brought in a filmmaker later on. They made a film about it. And here is his Brazilian colleague shooting for the film that came out a few years back. Alternative media, as we heard earlier, the West Bengal Crafts Council, Ruby Pal Chaudhary and her associates have been very influential in intervening into these local art communities. So they've been running workshops in Calcutta since the 70s, trying to initiate new kinds of projects and new media. So now you see them painting on non-narrative things, such as these pots, decorative pots, tabletops, and even 9/11 t-shirts. So you have a variety of things that have been entering into the repertoire as a result of globalization. So you have influences coming in, but we have to remember that globalization is always dialogic. It's a two-way street. And here we have the implosion part is things like the 9/11 story coming in. The explosion part is Gurupada and Sharno going out. So here they are at the Museum of International Folk Art in 2006 in Santa Fe, singing and doing workshops such as Rani has been doing here. Here they are performing for the audience in the gallery at Moifa. Here they are on their day off at lovely Abiquiu, New Mexico. Here they are at Sufi Sam's mosque, also near Abiquiu there. And finally, I should mention that Sharno, I suggested earlier, has become fairly successful because she's now showing in a modern art gallery in Calcutta. And this is a piece of hers on Matangini Hajra, a local female hero in Medinipur, who, and this will be it, this was sold at Sotheby's relatively recently. So alternative modernity, here we have the Monisha Mongol. You see the figure here, who is fairly typical of the iconic canon in terms of how men are represented. Here we see King Louis looking very much like this devotee of Monisha. And here we see me at my podium at Boston University giving a lecture. But then I reminded them that where are my glasses? So here I am looking more like Job Charnock. That's how they represent Job Charnock, the founder of Calcutta. And then others see me more as sort of this, a guy riding into the village on an elephant with his tape recorder and then leaving on my private jet from the airport. So just to end, here's again two images of transport in Calcutta, where you have a kind of collision of different forms of movement and transport. You have the trams, you have the horse-drawn carriages, you have the boats on the river, you have people walking, you have cars and so forth. And it's all about navigation, right, so that you don't crash into each other. And due to lack of time, I can't really develop this too much, but I just want to say in closing that the Portuguese have been fairly successful in navigating all of these various contestations and so forth, both socially and artistically, since at least the 13th century in Bengal. And despite the fact that Guru Sarai Datta, the romanticist we've been hearing a lot about today, despite the fact that he predicted in 1921 that they would be gone in a decade, here we are in 2014, and they're still going very strong, and Dukusham is still singing regularly, and I thank you for your attention. Time flies so quickly, huh? Okay. I'll just shut this down.
Thank you, Frank, who's been the only Mac user so far, so hurrah for Frank. Our second speaker this afternoon is Pika Ghosh, who comes to us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's an associate professor of art history there. She's also an old schoolmate of mine, going back to Calcutta. In fact, there are three of us from the same school here, so for us this is more like a school reunion, and I'm talking age 4 through 16, all right? So, or 18, yeah. So three of us here. Chandri Basu is the other cohort over here from, all from Calcutta, actually. Who would have thunk it? All of us art historians, yeah? So Pika poses this fascinating question, what exactly is a katha anyways, in her paper? And she's going to look at the agency now of textiles in the making of Bengali women's experiences and perceptions. And she focuses specifically on katha, which is a particular kind of quilt, which is stitched together with, well, we have layered fabric stitched together. She'll tell you more about it. And they're distinguished by white running stitches. And finally, you also have embroidery embellishing it. In fact, Himika Bhattacharya, who's here, is wearing a katha scarf. So at some point, if you're interested, you can take a look if you don't know what it's all about. I'm encouraging my students to do this, yeah. So Pika looks at the making of katha, thank you, Himika, as a performance. She looks at it as a domestic tradition, a mythology, a storytelling tool, and also, of course, a regional practice. Please join me in welcoming Pika to the podium.
I want to say thank you to Sue for inviting me and all of you guys who put this event together. It's tremendously useful for me to think through a lot of dodgy terminology or stuff that I've been shirking and uneasily putting quotation marks on. This morning was fabulous. And I'm going to say this, many of my pictures come from Dale Mason and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, so I want to acknowledge that, the impetus for this ongoing project. Okay. Katha, surviving from the 19th and first part of the 20th century in Bengali homes as well as museum collections, share features that distinguish them as a regional product of this period. They consist of heavily used, worn fabric, usually extracted from garments like women's saris, men's dhotis. These recycled layers, valued for their softness, are first secured at the corners and then strengthened while repairing at the same time. The surface may be further embroidered with colored threads, often pulled from the ornamental woven border patterns of the original fabric. The textiles have commonly been understood as the work of women and confined to domestic contexts of everyday and ceremonial and ritual use. That ranges from shawls to blankets, bedspreads, seating mats, baby blankets, even diapers. However, as in most everyday forms, there are myriad variations to the practice. Such diversity of creative and pragmatic innovation is perhaps more easily discernible in the work of the past few decades, as with Potuas, with dramatic shifts accompanying institutionalization and commodification. This is acknowledged in qualifications like Ashul Kantha, real Kantha, or Nokshi Kantha, elaborately designed ones, that are being employed in common parlance to distinguish the older continuous practices from more recent interventions, such as the more factory-like assembly line productions in Bangladesh and West Bengal for the larger NGOs than destined for boutiques in Delhi, Dhaka, London, Paris, New York. But domestic contexts also reveal experiments with techniques from applique to cross-stitch, in materials from jute sacks to plastic sheets, from wool to raffia and beads, not to mention iconographic inventiveness, whether Humpty Dumpty or Lal Kamal and Neel Kamal, one of the most popular tales from the Thakumar Jhuli collection of children's stories. And here you see, for those of you who know it, the characters Bangoma Bangumi. These innovations have further opened up what was always a flexible practice. And it begs us to attend then to the question that a colleague posed to me, what exactly is a kantha anyway? But today I want to go back to that earlier, equally dynamic, I would say, transformations embodied in a 19th century kantha in the Philadelphia collection, particularly the internal transformations, invisible yet invaluable, inside the individual who engages in the practice of embroidering. While I believe that the products have always been collaborative at multiple levels, as we have been saying today in pretty much most of these traditions, a few rare ones demonstrate remarkable coherence in imagery, aesthetic, and execution, and hence suggest the presence of an individual maker. In this case, she identifies herself explicitly by name. As traces of a meditative, even devotional practice, they suggest participation in the refining of selves and crafting of social worlds. Such concerns, of course, play into discussions about art versus craft, predicated on the privileging of uniqueness as criteria for visible thought, and as we have said today in much greater length, from the Renaissance to modernist discourse. But instead, I want to ask how we might understand the agency of textiles in the making of Bengali women's experiences and perceptions, and hence integral to their everyday lives. To do so, I examine this kantha, which I juxtapose with findings from ethnographic research among women in relatively traditional contexts, in order to begin to imagine a maker and her process behind the trace that is her handiwork. During fieldwork for this 2009 Philadelphia Kantha show, I became aware of the intimate bodily, mental, emotional, and tactile experience of making kanthas. First, in conversations at the Nag Chaudhuri home in Kolkata with the sisters-in-law Anima and Bonusri, and Shagor Moni Sarkar. Shagor came from Khulna, modern Bangladesh, in the 1960s, a time of turbulent negotiation in the wake of the partitionings of Bengal. She was a young widow in search of employment. She has gradually become an integral part of this Nag Chaudhuri home, introducing kantha making skills, which she brought from her childhood village home. She explained how important and tricky it was to prepare the thin inner layers of cloth, kantha pata, which are often themselves assembled by patching rags. These are placed carefully, one on top of the other, smoothed down by patting with one's hands to avoid any fold or wrinkle, then secured with date thorns and then loose stitches, kantha atkano. She also noted that the pattern on the woven border of the sari she happened to be wearing that day was a popular one that is reproduced very often in embroidery. As they showed me their work, they remembered the physical discomfort, even pain in the process. How the eyes are strained by such close hand-to-eye coordination, how the fingers get marked, the skin pricked and broken by the prodding end of the needle, and how the shoulders hurt from hunching. Yet they enjoyed the process, recalling the addictive pleasure, nesha, of embroidering, often staying up too late into the night, or working in the glow of candlelight. It was hard to put an emerging motif aside, as it was flowering, puteota, or as the fingers got into the rhythm of executing the running stitch with precision, picking up uniform numbers of threads with needle, so that the length of each stitch and the space between them evened out. As the needle advanced, the length of fabric left behind, in the other hand, grew to add to the satisfaction of accomplishment. I realized how the acute physical sensation was intensely personal and intimate reconnecting with oneself. The nostalgia for that exhilaration, arising from engagement of mind and body, was easily visible in their smiles. They remembered how difficult it was in their younger days, when they had a lot of domestic responsibilities, to turn away, to return to household chores like cooking dinner or taking care of the children. And they recall being chided by the in-laws for neglecting their domestic duties as they relished their quiet time in the silence of the night. The act of remembering the pattern of executing the running stitch between needle, cloth, and fingers and implementing it with speed and precision is inherently bodily. Through continuous repetition of stitches, the movement of the fingers, guiding the needle, then raising the arm to pull it, connects mind and body. In Paul Connaughton's terms, the memory for such skills is sedimented or amassed in the body, what we call body memory today. The body serves as the starting point for the activity, and the product is defined and delimited by that body. And useful here, of course, is Merleau-Ponty's undergirding that the object is never just an object in the world, but the ground of our very perceptions, whereby our worlds come into being. From this phenomenological perspective, repeated acts of stitching, whether creating the dense white stitches filling the surface of a kantha, or repeated words and motifs, with all their variation, can become viscerally grounded acts of meditation. Individual and deeply personal, embroidery is thus akin in some ways to more familiar meditations like the Tibetan sand mandalas. And the implements, cloth, needle, and thread, become tools for structuring a transformative internal and spiritual experience in the everyday domestic context. This chador, shawl, inscribed throughout with the chant Hare Ram, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, which reverberates in homes, temples, streets in Bengali towns and villages, explicitly visualizes such embroidered meditations. In the Vaishnava context, remembrance of Krishna in the repeated articulation of his names is considered one of the most effective ways of reaching him. Assiduous stitched repetition of sacred words, along with the repetition of uniform stitches to create them, may have been such a process of cultivating a meditative state, like women chanting the names of God at their home altars with Rudraksha beads. Another aspect of the creativity of the kanthas inheres in combining designs and stories to express new visions, to adorn recycled fabric surfaces. The range of motifs and narratives is shared with other expressive forms, of course, visual, performed, and literary. And a careful examination suggests that kantha embroiderers selected from this regional repertoire, sometimes skillfully juxtaposing images, raising issues, inventing identities through variations of size, color, and composition. Because embroidering is a slow, meticulous, and individual process, stitching familiar episodes of well-known narratives with the particular nuances they accrued over time must also be understood as a personal act of contemplation. Here, the imagery assembled is explicitly framed as such by embroidered words. And what reads, which is actually on that fourth side, and I will show you a detail, can be translated as, draped with this cloth on my body, I write thus at the feet of Hari, Krishna, his servant Kamala, which is the name of the maker, in Vrindavan, Radha, and Krishna. The fabric surface is devoted to stories of this single deity, Krishna, and stretched along the four sides of this ripe seed-laden lotus at the center. The episodes from Krishna's life and ways of worshipping him have been popular since the Gaudiya Bengali sacred community coalesced during the 16th and 17th centuries as Chaitanya sang of the passionate love of Radha and Krishna and offered an intensely personal and deeply emotional engagement as the preferred spiritual mode. The embroiderer, Kamala's interpretation of these images, their juxtapositions, surely presents her devotional vision actively creating her own cosmology, as much as it responds to the social, political, and religious contingencies of the historical moment of 19th century Bengal. In the delta, a crisscrossing web of distributaries of two major river systems, flooded annually by torrential monsoons, water and its related activities are ubiquitous. Here, water is the site of pleasures, like these full lotus blossoms burgeoning at the center and the four corners of the kantha. Although lotuses are typically pink or white, blue lotuses were imagined in the Bengali Ramayana. These magical flowers were obtained by Ram and offered to Durga for her help to overcome Ravana in the battle. The flowers at the four corners perhaps explicate Krishna's relationship to Ram, and Krishna is also known as Ramanuj. Moreover, the embroiderer identifies herself as Kamala, hence her choice of such loving detailing of the visual elements of the lotus, perhaps an elaboration of her own name, thus grounds these Krishna stories in her self-perception, maybe a form of self-cultivation that is manifest and yet also invisible, hidden like in many other Vaishnava practices. Four narrative scenes are skillfully framed by verdant foliage and the golden globular blossoms of the Kadamba tree, a favored spot for many of Radha and Krishna's trysts. Nauka Bilash, Krishna's boat ride with Radha and the gopis across the Jamuna river, spreads between two of these trees. The embroiderer has chosen a particularly popular boat type, Mayur Punkhi, the peacock-feathered boat, a light but richly ornamented, pillared, and canopied pleasure boat, very popular across multiple media in the 19th century. It is lavishly detailed here in a dexterous array of stitches that distinguish, for example, the soft velvet texture of the bird's sinuous neck from the coarseness of wet wood planks comprising the body of the boat. The blue of the peacock prow balances the dark-skinned Krishna, poised at the tail end. The plumes radiating outward from the bent neck of the peacock complements his feathered headdress. Through her choice of stitches, the embroiderer surely invokes textures of meaning. In the choice of boat type and composition elements, she also visually relocates this divine dalliance, which supposedly took place in North India, to the Bengal Delta, making the eternal play of the gods familiar and contemporary. And might visualizing such preferences stitch by stitch imbue the episode with the immediacy and accessibility that was sought in the Gaudiya spiritual quest. Here Krishna is the boatman, casually dangling an oar from one hand, raising a flute to his lips with the other. The gopis, bearing their dairy goods, align themselves in two tiers, in a composition that bears striking resemblance to contemporary renditions, such as this print. Radha is given pride of place in the pavilion, and closest to Krishna is Barai Buri, the elderly widow who served as liaison, often complicit with Krishna, managing their trysts. Her raised hands suggest such an act of conspiring with him. The image conflates the many rides Krishna offered the dairymaids across the turbulent river. One of the numerous opportunities he sought to waylay them and to seduce Radha in particular. 15th century Bengali poets Chandidas and Vidyapati offer the earliest articulations of this episode, which grew in popularity in 17th century temple terracottas, woodcut prints, Baluchari weaves, and Potua scrolls, of course. And they continue to be told to this day in many other contexts as well. In Chandidas's narration, Krishna's dinghy could only hold 2 people at a time, so he ferried each of the gopis individually, taking Radha last, to demand her jewelry and her affections as payment. And I quote, "I have this boat of 5 wood planks. I myself control the helm. Look, pay heed to my demands. I took your girlfriends over safely as you asked. If I am to ferry you, give your necklace on deposit. Since I saw your moon-like face, I've staked out the river. If you'll consent, I'll take you at once. I've immersed my thoughts in you. Hold me tight. Make good the tolls." The 19th century poet, on the other hand, Ram Bosu's version, may voice the concerns of women on such journeys. His Radha describes the outcome as follows. "Taking me into the boat, the rake started his tricks. He said, 'Rai, the Jamuna river is turbulent. You have worn a blue garment. Mistaking it for the clouds, the wind is getting excited. In the middle of the river, he asked me to strip. Alas, where am I to hide my shame?'" Such renditions suggest analogies with the trips on the Hooghly, undertaken by elite men, Bengali as well as European, with their dancers, courtesans, and ordinary prostitutes. These escapades were articulated in both the visual and literary works of the period. The sheer frequency of themes like the boat ride urges us to pay attention to the social, religious, and political contingencies they might engage in. In the 15th century, Vidyapati also imagined this incident, but from Radha's viewpoint and with different nuance. On sharp currents of the river, the boat was launched, but Krishna was young. He could not steer. "So I swam across. My bracelet snapped, my necklace broke. Friend, don't scold me. My earrings dropped. I searched till dusk. My makeup was washed away. My face looks clean as the moon, idling on the banks of the river. My breasts were scratched with thorns." Says Vidyapati, "You speak so plausibly, people might even believe you." His final comment indicates that her recounting is at variance with the evidence on her body. He points instead to the special sweetness of the Radha-Krishna relationship that was so valued in Bengal. Married to another man, marked by red sindoor in the part of her hair on this katha, Radha had to undergo great difficulties to keep their trysts, to manage her loyalties in the face of much humiliation and social condemnation. In compromising her social standing for the divine, forsaking all else for him, she offered the paradigm for devotion. Embroidered stitch by stitch, her story is visualized here as a type that is shared with all of these other media, prints, terracottas, and silk. And yet fundamentally, it is at variance simply because the author is female and gives voice to her presence in a way that the others do not. While regional identity is continually and dynamically being reconstructed through iterations across these media, her choices simultaneously map the contours of female devotional imagination at this time. And the boat ride is further layered with another episode between the divine lovers, identified explicitly here as Dan Kondo, the toll collection. It directs our attention to the dairy goods on the women's heads. Krishna, as tax collector, blocks Radha's way, again to seduce her. In Chandidas's verse, he declares, quote, "Under a tree near the Jamuna, that is Krishna's station. You cannot evade me, Radha. No tricks or speeches. Offer me your love. I am Krishna. I collect taxes. And at first, Radha chides him. Krishna, so show some reason. Pay heed to what I'm saying. All my ghee and buttermilk and yogurt have been ruined. Yesterday, Jashoda fed you from her bosom, and now, as customs agent, you're asking me for tribute? Isn't there the slightest sense of shame in you? But later she succumbs, as awareness of his divine nature begins to override the concern for propriety. Oh, my Krishna, as I went to market, you were staring at me. From path to path, you followed me. Only then I realized that what's happened was predestined. You, the son of Nanda, will never let me leave you. The two episodes reinforce this fundamental call of the divine to which the mortal surrenders, juggling social responsibilities as surely the embroiderer would have done in her own life. Opposite the boat ride, Krishna rides a magical horse comprised of 8 gopis. Such fantastic composite beasts, horses or elephants, give visual form to desire, the desire to unite with the divine. A gopi's raised hand serves as stirrup to support the feet of the god on this horse. Another, probably Radha, leads the horse, privileged again, like in the boat's pavilion. But her position may also allude to the complexities of their relationship. If Krishna traps her on the boat and on the way to market, she now leads his horse. She controls the lovesick youth. Balancing such scenes invites us to compare them across from each other for its serial juxtaposition of Krishna's biographical episodes in a way that is harder to do when you have vertical narrations of episodes in chronological order or single scenes. And it suggests that she's really using her medium to make the most of particular choices and juxtapositions. On the third side is the beloved baby who crawled to his mother's butter churn. Here he is caught red-handed. Women who stitch kathas at home would likely have had similar experiences. They may have worshipped Krishna as a baby too at their home altars. Woodcut versions identify the episode as Dodhimantan, the churning of yogurt, yet another Bengali iteration, the Mishti Doi version of North Indian butter. And yet we know that when she opens his mouth, she sees the universe is swirling there. Embroidery, a slow and deliberate process, must surely have enhanced the intimacy of what is depicted, made the stitches resonant with memories that remain tantalizingly elusive to us today. Opposite, the divine couple is flanked by 8 women, likely the select set of Radha's 8 closest friends. This scene appears as it may have in Krishna temples, such as this temple dedicated to Madan Mohan at Bishnupur for celebration of Rash, the circle dance with the gopis. And again, they suggest thoughtful pairings of episodes to make connections. The remarkable coherence of imagery, crafted exquisitely, allows us an intimate glimpse into a woman's creation of a personal cosmology. As with most women around the world, the everyday lives of Bengali women were rarely recorded before the 20th century. For many, kathas may well be the only trace of their presence to have survived, the only evidence to hear for their viewpoints and their voices. Katha imagery thus offers a valuable viewpoint into an otherwise obscure domain. Yet, of course, because we know relatively little about these women in Katha collections, we cannot reconstruct with too much precision either the historical conditions or the specific criteria they weighed as they made their choices. When the same general theme is rendered on more than one katha, we can compare the choices in constructing an intimate vision while visualizing the worldview shared in the community. If the 4 scenes on the Philadelphia katha are nuanced by an embroiderer who has explicitly identified herself as a Krishna devotee, This one displays the performance of the sacred verse amidst the living community that performs it. Singers raise their hands in dance, drumming and playing various instruments. And the collective activity is called Shankirtan. The tiered form in the center suggests the Rath, a chariot procession at the center. And here, the stitched words, repeated over and over, frame the devotees along the outer border as if imbuing them with the power of those sounds. A fourth katha displays these text-image relationships differently while still employing repetition so central in both embroidery and meditation. It surely engages with the flood of printed matter, newspapers, pamphlets, playbills, illustrated books, and of course the specifically Gaudiya institutional agenda to mobilize print to proliferate hagiographical materials, song and prayer books, and printed shawls called Namaboli. And I show you two excerpted versions on the right. Transformations are thus constituted stitch by stitch, from katha to katha, individual to individual, as they also speak to the larger changes shared across the larger visual and cultural domains and a shared sacred landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Pika. There's all kinds of worlds opening up over here. We should have had Mishti Doi for the afternoon, but well. Unfortunately, our last speaker, David Santon, could not come because he's fallen very ill. He's the president of the Ethnic Arts Foundation. He's also the former executive director of International and Area Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. But we do have Peter Ziernes, who will be speaking, or rather reading his paper on David's behalf. David's paper is entitled Variations on a Theme, the Kobar Through Space and Time. And the paper is part of an effort to counter the fundamental misconception and the reluctant destructiveness of the social, political, and economic hierarchies of labels or distinctions like fine art versus, say, tribal art. These are labels that we're all struggling with clearly today, especially with reference to Mithila painting. So thank you, Peter, for doing the very brave task of taking on David's paper for us, for being his voice.
Okay, I'll leave it there, and then I'll just go down. Good. Yeah, cool. Hello. Two surprises. One, me, not David. And surprise number two is that the paper that David was going to deliver actually was all in his head. And he had collected 20, 30 slides on the Khobar, and that he was going to talk about them. He asked me instead to deliver a paper called Mithila Painting, 1949 to 2014, which will be appearing in the Marg magazine in a couple of months. And I have edited it down since it was meant not to be here, and so we'll see what we can do. In 1949, William G. Archer contributed an article to Marg, Volume 3, Number 3, entitled Mithila Painting. It was the first article to bring public attention to the painting tradition. Despite some problematic interpretations, Archer provided a thorough and appreciative account of the social and ritual context, conventions, sources of variation and uses of line and color in the ancient wall painting tradition widespread across the Mithila region of Bihar. Beginning his article with Blake's, that's the poet William Blake's concept, art centered on, quote, invention and visionary conception, end of quote, Archer ended it in his own words. In the best art, there is an inescapable element of strangeness. the sense of a novel wonder, a mystery burning at the heart of life. And it is this strangeness, this incandescence, which above all, the painting of Matilda transmits. In a later article called Into Hidden Maytil, Archer reflected more broadly on the day he discovered the paintings. And by discovered means that Archer was, for those of you who don't know, was a British civil servant stationed in Bihar in 1934 when there was a devastating earthquake, 8.2 on the Richter scale. Knocked down walls, knocked down houses. He went up to Bihar. He wasn't Bihar, but he went up to Madhubani and that area, and of course walls had been knocked down, houses opened up, and he saw all of the work that had been hidden on the walls of the houses, the murals, the Matilda paintings. And in this article, he writes about the day that he discovered them. He said, he describes a Brahmin home. I could see the walls were covered with brilliantly painted murals. Everything meandered, yet everything cohered. The faces had a gay insouciance, the fanciful contortions of a Clay or Miro. The figures also had a dreamlike vacuousness. Their very freedom from what was normal sparked off the imagination, and one felt as if one was in a fairy-like palace, brimful of wonder. I had seen nothing elsewhere in India which so instinctively took for granted the assumptions of modern European art. In a Kayast home, however, he noted that while the imagery was similar, the style of their murals was quite distinct. It presupposed the same liberties, the same repudiation of truth to natural appearances, the same determination to project a forceful idea of a subject rather than a factual record. But in contrast to the Brahmins, Kayast women were vehement. They portrayed their main subject with shrill boldness, with savage forcefulness. If Maytil Brahmin murals resembled Miro or Clay, here was Picasso, naked and unashamed. Now, I just want everybody in the room to know that this is Archer and not David speaking, okay? Let's get that straight. Okay. He then went on to say, all murals were the work of women. Men had no part in them. In a kind of underground conspiratorial manner, each group of women tapped a regional reservoir of idioms, providing each bride and bridegroom with the heavenly images requisite for their bliss. And after that, he says, I must confess that for at least an hour, I forgot the earthquake and its horrors. I was entranced by what I saw. They were a product of pre-industrial India. I was a product of sophisticated England. Yet in these murals, we somehow electrically met. What they took for granted, I considered superb. The art was there and made us one. I saw the beauty on the mud. If it was an earthquake that opened up these murals to the world, then it was a drought in 1968 that caused them to be transferred onto paper. There was a severe drought up in the area, and Pupul Jayakar, who was then head of the All India Handloom Board, commissioned an artist from Bombay, Bhaskar Kulkarni, to go to Jitwapur and Ranchi and try to convince the women, remember this is a very conservative society, try to convince them to actually start painting on paper and try to sell those to get some income. Luckily for us and for everyone concerned, some of these women were highly, highly good. The first paintings on paper that Kulkarni brought back to New Delhi for exhibition caused a sensation. Almost immediately, two Kayast painters, Ganga Devi and Mahasundari Devi, and two Brahmin painters, Sita Devi and Jagadamba Devi, were recognized as extraordinary artists. They drew on the conventions of wall paintings, yet each quickly developed their own distinctive and immediately recognizable style. All four received private and government commissions, and during the early 1970s, Ganga Devi and Sita Devi were sent by the government of India to represent India in cultural exhibitions in Japan, Russia, Europe, and the United States. Inspired and encouraged by the successes and income generated by these celebrated artists, hundreds of women in many villages in Madhubani district began painting on paper from the early 1970s through the 1990s. Among them were an expanding array of highly original, innovative, technically skilled, and consistently productive artists from various castes. Drawing on their personal knowledge and experience, an expanded version of Archer's regional reservoir of idiom, these artists painted the full array of marriage and other rituals, extended narratives of their own lives, episodes from local oral traditions and classical texts, as well as descriptions and wry critiques of contemporary life. Yet, despite expanding the repertoire, they insisted upon working within the severe aesthetic conventions of Mattila painting. Two-dimensional imagery, no horizon line or use of perspective, no modeling of figures, deities facing forward, humans in profile, open spaces filled with flowers, plants, and trees, and a frame painted on the paper itself, often reflecting the theme of the painting. In 1986, after being shown a collection of 50 paintings by these artists, Stella Kromrich, at the time the Dean of South Asian Art History in the US, flatly asserted, quote, "Mattila painting is the most vital tradition in contemporary Indian art," end of quote. While obviously some might dispute that, it is striking how many outsiders, non-Maytils, starting with W.G. Archer, have become entranced by the paintings. He was followed in the 1960s by Pupal Jayakar, who visited with the painters and wrote extensively about them. Then Bhaskar Kulkarni, who assisted them in transferring their paintings from walls to paper. Since then, many other critics, artists, and collectors, both Indian and foreign, have been struck by the power, beauty, and sophisticated knowledge underlying the paintings. Upendra Maharati, the Patna-based artist, collector, and cultural promoter in the early 1970s, started grading paintings on artistic quality from D to A+. You know, no Fs, right? No Fs, all right. During that same period, Erich Moser Schmidt, a German filmmaker, made repeated trips to the Dusad community, just 100 meters from Sita Devi's home in Jitwarpur. There she encouraged the Dusad women to develop a Godara painting, a distinctive iconography based on their protective tattoos and their own ancient cultural traditions. Also during the early 70s, the French journalist Yves Vacon made several trips to the villages, collected paintings, made a film about the painters, mounted exhibitions in Paris and Barcelona, and wrote Women Painters of Mattila. The French edition is in 76, the English translation in 77. Like Archer, he never used the term folk art in his writings. Indeed, towards the end of his introduction to the book, he expressed his hope that a school of modern art might develop there. From 1976 to 2000, the American anthropologist Raymond Owens made 7 extended trips to Madhubani, staying in Ranti and Jitwarpur for many weeks to many months at a time. Owens made 2 films about the painters, encouraged the artists to do their best work, and paid them 20 to 30 times the amounts offered by local and Delhi-based dealers. He then brought the paintings to the US, where he and colleagues founded the not-for-profit Ethnic Arts Foundation to mount exhibitions and sales in the US, South Africa, and India. And as further encouragement to the artists, he returned the profits from sales to the painters whose works had been sold. There's also Tokyo Hasegawa, the Japanese poet, composer, and musician, who first visited Madhubani in the mid-1980s, has also been an important external influence. Aside from purchasing numerous paintings, he established the Mattila Museum in the mountains northwest of Tokyo, the only museum in the world specifically dedicated to Mattila painting. The museum also houses a studio to which Hasegawa has for 2 decades invited pairs of Mattila painters for 3 to 9 month residence, providing their travel, living expenses, and a monthly stipend, and enabling them to work without disruption on larger, more ambitious paintings than possible at home and in Madhubani. Finally, Jyotirindra Jain's stunning 1997 volume, Ganga Devi, Tradition and Expression in Mattila Painting, both excited and encouraged many artists and brought new national and international attention to Ganga Devi and the art form generally. And much like Blake defining art as invention and visionary conception, and Archer's account of the paintings is marked by novel wonder and freedom from what was normal, Jain writes that Ganga Devi, quote, transforms the ordinary commonplace images of hotel facades, motor cars, national flags, ticket booths, roller coasters, and people carrying shopping bags into imaginary and fantastic objects. Clearly, the fundamental sources of the continuing creativity and innovation of the artists working in the Mithila tradition derive from their individual and collective knowledge and passions, their skill and rich visual imagination. In effect, a continuously expanding version of Archer's reservoir of idioms. However, the recognition, encouragement, and support of outside patrons, audiences, and markets, much as artists everywhere have always depended upon, have also played an important role in the continuing evolution and vitality of the painting tradition. At the same time, India, Bihar, and even village Mithila have also been changing economically, socially, culturally, and at an accelerated pace with the new millennium. This was especially true for young women who, with increased access to education, the media, and images of urban life, were less inclined to settle for narrowly domesticated village life and were instead eager to study English, commerce, computers, and to move to urban centers. Indeed, by 2002, many established artists feared the painting tradition would die soon because few young women were still interested in learning to paint, as they had for generations from their mothers, aunts, and older sisters. That in turn prompted the EAF's offer to use Owen's bequest to establish a free art school, the Mithila Art Institute in Madhubani, in the hope that young women might be more interested in learning their own tradition at a formal art school taught by major artists. All agreed it seemed worth trying, and while most doubted it would last more than 2 or 3 years, when the MAI opened in February 2003, 108 young women, mostly 18 to 25 years old, applied for the 25 places. Since then, every year, some 250 to 300 young women and a few young men from villages as much as 50 kilometers away and from all across the caste spectrum enter the annual blind entrance competition. They show up, they're given a number, and they have to paint on the spot of painting in 4 hours. And that is then judged by people like Ronnie Jha back there and other teachers, master teachers at the school. The teachers at the MAI are all senior painters, and the first 6 months of the year-long curriculum focuses on command of the materials, drawing, and the traditional iconography. For the next 6 months, the students are free to paint what they wish, traditional or contemporary imagery. Many do both. At the end of the year, the most serious and talented students are off at a second year of training. Okay. I didn't hit it this time when I turned the page, right? While the MAI has made important contributions, there are also highly productive and original new generation artists based in the surrounding communities and from all across the caste spectrum. At present, 6 new generation artists, 3 from the local communities and 3 graduates of MAI stand out for their continuous productivity, technical and expressive power, and breadth of subject matter. Well, the first artist on David's list here needs no introduction. It's Ronnie Jha again. And what happened to the... Hit that? Or hit... Yeah, that's 2, and so this is, you saw the first piece was the abortion clinic in 2004. Can I get that back? How do I get that back? Anybody know?
I think...
Look at that, easy. Back. All right, the abortion clinic in 2004. You saw it downstairs. Yes, it's in the show, so the color is really very dramatic. It's a pregnant woman on a gurney viewing the ultrasound while her mother-in-law insists she abort the female fetus, and her daughter pleads with her to save her unborn sister. And in here, I asked Ronnie why that's the female doctor, and she's in a cobra here. This figure. And Ronnie Jha said that in these clinics, the doctors are more deadly than cobras. And up here you see, I don't know if you can see it from there, it's 5,000. It's a 5,000 rupee note, which is what the abortion costs. Okay, let's see if this works. Ah, okay. And here's number 2, okay, which is in the past, women could only peek through the curtain. Now we are joining together and breaking through the curtain. No, wrong. How do I get out of this? That, perfect. I'll get it. Ah, he was downstairs also in the show, Naresh Kumar Paswan. 2 years ago, he walked normally around January, so we go to Madhubani because the weather is better than it is in the summer. And he walked into the hotel we're staying from a village. We knew nothing about him. He was not a student, carrying a number of pieces, all in black and white, 2 pieces in black and white that were just fantastic. And David bought them immediately, and we never saw him again. The following year, he showed up with a huge roll under his arm. None of the pieces were his, and he didn't pretend they were his. They just weren't his. He had just gone around collecting pieces he thought he would try to sell, and then he disappeared. So we thought maybe that was it. A year ago, January, he comes in with another roll, all of his, all black and white, and absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic pieces. So self-taught from the village of Simri, which has Lalita Devi is a famous painter who is there. She no longer paints, however. But so he has had some training. But if you ask him, who do you follow? Which painter do you follow? He says, I don't follow anybody. I'm the best. I'm the best. And I guess that's what an artist needs in order to succeed. This is a fantastic piece. I don't know if you can see Hanuman. Can you see? Hanuman has a little beard there and the club and his build. Hanuman looks tough, and he's supposed to be tough, right? But you normally see Hanuman as being very kind and very sort of deferential. But here he's up there. This is another piece by him. Cityscape. He will be teaching, I think, 2 days a week at the Mithila Art Institute, I understand. I'm very happy that he agreed to do so. I'm interested in seeing, Ronnie, how students react since he only works in black and white. Yeah. That will be interesting to see how that works out. Okay. Hmm? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. Ah, Dolari Devi, starting in 2002. She's of the Fisher community. Turned out to be a brilliant colorist, muralist, and social commentator. As in this figure, where she paints the flood that she herself witnessed of 2008 in her village, depicting what she saw. The rich family, okay, has a boatman, okay, with a big lock on their door. And while the poor are left to fish the dead out of the water and mourn for those left behind.
She's eating with Rani. You know, there are 2 teachers in the art, and she's one.
Aha. That's the other. This is her Durga. This is her style. If you've never seen her, she's extremely, as I said, a great colorist. And I think does she have a Ganesha in the show downstairs? Yeah. And some of her Ganeshas are almost psychedelic. Okay. And this is the most elegant Durga I have ever seen, I think. No? I mean, this is not, she has the lion and she has all the weapons, but she seems, you could easily hang this on the wall, hang this on your wall and not be afraid, huh? I did that again. Good, it went away. Shalini Kumari, young artist. I'll read David here. The first to emerge was Shalini Kumari, who has an extraordinary capacity to draw on traditional motifs and imagery to address contemporary issues and concerns. This was manifest in her 2009 solo exhibition in a major San Francisco gallery that included figure 7, that's this one, where the weeping Mother Earth prays to the sun god to spare the earth from global warming.
He's one of our students, takes the students from his art.
Yeah.
Is this the one you sent to Obama?
No,
Yeah, this is the same one. Who?
no,
She didn't do the Obama one?
not this one. Another one where globalization, I will show you tomorrow.
Okay.
No, I have.
And this is a recent piece by her called Passion, Generation, and Creation. She moved to Delhi, got married, moved to Delhi, and now she's down in Hyderabad, yes? Yeah. Okay. Rambaros Jha, okay, he's had as a continuing interest in underwater imagery and mythology, as well as the power of the line and abstraction in Mithila painting, evident in figure 9, Nagkanya and turtles. It's a beautiful piece. For those of you downstairs, there is an abstract piece. It almost looks like an anvil. It's all alone on a wall. If you don't remember it, take a look at it again. It's by him. And if you look closely, well, I don't know how well you can see his water lines, and he uses a nib pen. And so all of this is done. At first I thought he must be using some kind of comb or something. I couldn't understand how the heck he gets these lines to match so well. But it's all done with a nib pen, and just takes him, it must take him forever to do it, and to have the patience as these different swirls here, and there are different swirls. Everything is just, it's amazing. It comes really alive. We're almost there. I only have 2 more to go. And this piece is a collage. The first collage in Mithila painting by Rambaros. And it happened because he was painting and not satisfied with his paintings and kept tearing them up. And at one point he looked down and saw all this stuff on the floor, and he said, wait a minute. Picked it up and started putting it together, and thus the first collage in Mithila art. Okay? And finally, this is Amrita Jha. She and Rambaros are actually brother and sister, but they do not paint together, and she paints quite differently, very clearly. David writes, paints with clarity, intensity, hard-edged detail, drawing on both spiritual convictions and deep personal insights. This is a lovely, lovely piece, but then watch this. Okay, that's downstairs in the show, all right? It's called Identity Crisis, 2013, so it's a brand new piece in which the Naga, the males in her life, keep pressing her to turn in one direction and another. Okay. So in conclusion, if Blake, Archer, Jayakar, Maharati, Moser, Kramrish, Hasagawa, Owens, and Jain are correct, an original work of this sort, carried out with passion, intensity, skill, vision, and imagination, is art. What kind of art is it? Clearly, it is an art deeply rooted in Indian tradition, but like all art, it draws simultaneously on both past and present, on ancient truths and current concerns. Some years ago, Lalita Devi, one of the finest painters of her generation, depicted a many-armed Durga with a broom and pots and pans in her hands rather than weapons. Recalling the painting, she said, an older man told me this was not Durga, but I told him that he keeps looking for Durga in the sky, but he doesn't see the hundreds of Durgas around him every day. Okay. Like other vital art forms, Mithila painting has evolved and grown over time and space. In this dynamic matrix, these artists have been drawing on their personal and social experience and have been using a set of distinctive indigenous techniques and conventions, in effect, a visual language, to express powerful images and ideas. And strikingly, while all of the patrons mentioned above have engaged personally and at length with these painters in their paintings, none write of them as folk artists or Mithila painting as folk art. As in all art traditions, there are painters engaged in Blake's facsimile representations, but the specific painters mentioned above, even though they may live and work in rural communities, are producing a sophisticated, alternative, contemporary art that is rooted in a distinctive, flexible, powerful, and evolving indigenous Indian aesthetic and expressive tradition. As W.G. Archer discerned 80 years ago, and as Yves Vacon hoped for nearly 40 years ago, Mithila painting is indeed a modern art that is both parallel and provides a compelling alternative to the colonial introduction of European pictorial traditions and the fickle fashions of the current globalized art world. Okay.
Questions for our speakers? Actually, Peter, if you don't mind staying up here. And Pika and Frank, if you don't mind coming to the table, please.
We can have Ronnie.
Yes, Rani? Rani, yes, finally, yes, please, sure. I think we have enough seats.
If you don't know information,
I seem to have the mic. So thank you all for really provocative papers. And I wanted to, my question's actually for Pika, but in some ways it's inspired by the connection or the juxtaposition, I suppose, between Pika's paper and Frank's paper, and also some of the outward-looking images of the Mithila painters, because it struck me that we think of these embroideries as very much about a domestic space, and when you were describing the program, really, of that one kanta you focused on, it reminded me of your earlier work with the terracotta temples and the programs there. Just sort of distantly, right? But it's similar kinds of iconographies, but not exactly the same because it's a woman and because it's for a domestic use. And it struck me that actually, and maybe this is my own limitation, not in your paper, but that these works are, we think of these works as being almost in a very Western sense private, but in fact, if we acknowledge the very distributed viewing of these works within particularly the women's world of Bengal, that in fact they're very much seen all the time. So they're in fact very like a temple, right? Even though on one sense we think of the temple as a sort of public space that people see, and these as more private. In fact, that's a false projection, I think. And I was thinking about it because it's on one hand, it seems like the embroideries might be different from some of these others that are seen publicly, that are done for performance and things like this. But in fact, it struck me in your paper that they might actually also have a resonance that's very much broader than how we normally conceive of them. Does that make sense? So that they're not just always folded up in a trunk somewhere. They're actually brought out and shown. So I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about this idea of domestic, right? And maybe how we question that as well in your work. So just a sort of provocation.
I think in my head I had that more large public space. You nailed me on that bit. Even though I talk about all these domestic flows and, you know, the written stuff is, the published stuff is really about object flows. I still think they're limited and contained. Not that temple worship isn't. Temples have their regular communities that are viewing. But I think there's a different quality. You know, textiles, I mean, you touch and you graze with your eyes in a way that you don't. Even when the panels are about this big, you know, you still got a sort of a distance from it because it's architecture, you know. But then the question becomes, and I axed a whole chunk of this, you know, when you look at these things, one seating mat, let's say, is the priest going to sit on that thing? And he's obviously not looking, right? He's looking at the deity in front. It's not really for looking, but it's surely an object of this quality is brought out for special occasions. Was it spread on some, you know, surface and people hovered around and went, ooh, I love that. And how did you do that? I want to learn that. You know, that kind of intimate gatherings. And when it traveled through generations, maybe to homes, and this is how objects in certain flows end up across continents, they take different nuance. You know, women cry in their kanthas in Philadelphia when they're homesick, and they, you know, make them when they don't know what else would be the most appropriate gift for a particular relationship. So there's that, those kinds of intimacies of viewing environments with textile, just because the nature, I mean, I think material here is really important. Not that textile can't be public. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one intimacy of viewing like we do in a museum typically, but it's smaller groups of viewing experiences. Maybe that's as much as I can imagine, you know. But on the other hand, when you have a large seating mat and a bunch of people sit down to eat, you know, at a festive meal, for example, nobody's really paying any attention to the, you know what I mean? So there's so many kinds of viewing where you're eyeballing versus scrutinizing or just, you know, loving it with your touch.
Could I ask a related question to that? I guess I'm allowed to ask a question even though I'm on this side of the table. But, you know, a lot of comments have been made in the literature in the past about the relationship between Kanta and Alpona and the Broadkota tradition. But since most of that is out of context, right? You read it in Obonindranath, for example, in the book that Dariel showed on La Alpona. But what the women you spoke with, do they make that connection in their own heads? Because, you know, the Alpana, obviously, some of the designs are very similar in their mandala-like effect and so on. But then the Alpana is, of course, ephemeral. It's washed away once the ritual is done. But do they have that model in their minds, do you think, when they're making them, since you've spoken extensively with these women?
Yes
There
and
seems to be a
no.
parallel.
There is an awareness of shared motifs, and quite self-consciously so in certain situations, because, you know, they will say in certain village you do the epiglottis of the dog, and it shows up in multiple, you know, media. But in other cases, but you know, I think the skills are different in making. So on the one hand, in a very rural context, we can, I think, still expect there are women who do both. But that incredible level of skill, I haven't seen in families where kantha making is still active, doing it on both. You know, I mean, there are people who make spectacular alpona. I mean, my mother was one. Every wedding she was asked in the family from the time she was about 15 to do those elaborate, going down the stairs and into foyers and lobbies and into the street sometimes. But you know,
And then
it's different.
when the girl sits on the Alpana, they use the pidi, that low-lying seat, the wooden chair kind
Which
of
we
thing.
paint,
bench.
yeah.
Yeah, so do you sit actually on the kanta, or do you is there also the use of the pidi?
The
You
pindi
said
has
that
a
they're
particular
sat on.
practical use, right? I mean, there are lots of people who can pitch in on this. You lift it up and circulate, move 7 times around, na, Shaptapati, your husband, and you know, all your brothers do that. It's a stabilizing element. Imagine carrying someone like me on a cloth. Wouldn't work, you know. But on the other hand, the priest is sitting on an ashram, a mat, and doing his puja right there. And
On
I've
top of
observed
the
kanta
concept.
mats in that context. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's
So that's sort of another parallel with the Alpina tradition in a sense.
those share motifs.
Yeah.
With the floor versus
Performative.
the paint. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and even if it's different surfaces and
Different
different pigments.
canvas,
And,
yeah.
I think you should ask Ronnie to chip in on this comment because she has some very powerful things to say about why women paint Mithila painting and have painted on the walls both in the past and currently. So maybe she could comment on what women get out of doing these kinds of crafts themselves. Did somebody interpret for me in case she didn't get it all?
जो बनाते हैं
पेंट करते
या
हैं व्हाई दे पेंट
या
यू नो
अरे केवल वही नहीं था, थोड़ा और भी था कि ये जो महिलाएं पहले मिथिला पेंटिंग दीवारों पे करती थी ना, जैसे आप उस दिन बता रहे थे कि घरों के अपने घर के अंदर एक डोमेस्टिक जैसा स्पेस में करती थी, फिर उसको
वापस
बाद में
क्यों?
बाहर करने लगी,
हाँ,
right?
हाँ, हाँ।
तो इन दोनों में कोई कनेक्शन है, कैसे
या।
शुरू हुआ और महिलाओं के लिए इसका क्या मतलब है?
Sorry to say that I am not fluent in English, but मैं
Perfectly good English.
yeah.
I'm hearing.
yeah. First, this Mithila painting is a typical painting which preserved only by women from century to century. There are so many reasons. Someone
बताइए.
मुझे लगता है कि ऋग्वेदा पीरियड में मिथिला में महिलाओं को बहुत सारे अधिकार मिले हुए थे.
I believe that during the Vedic period, when Rigveda was written up, women had a lot of rights, freedoms.
Yeah,
In Mithila,
in-
sorry, yes, in Mithila. This is specific to Mithila, yes.
इसमें 10वीं सदी में जब वहाँ पर मिथिला पर कुछ मतलब मुगल्स आए हैं तो फिर महिलाओं को प्रोटेक्शन के लिए बंद करना पड़ा है. वो एक सामाजिक बाध्यता थी कि महिलाओं को घर के अंदर सुरक्षा के दृष्टिकोण से रखा गया था.
So in 10th century, about when the Mughals,
हाँ, yeah.
that's what she's.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Muslims.
The Muslims,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
When the Muslim conquest.
Sorry,
yeah,
Muslim.
started. So at that point.
12th में मुगल, yeah, सही.
Yeah, and that day actually you did
हाँ,
say
yeah.
that too. So women began to be locked indoors for safety, for protection from the invaders. So that was, so it was like a social requirement, is what she was saying.
तो जब महिलाओं को बंद कर दिया गया था तो विश्व के 6 दर्शन में से 4 दर्शन मिथिला से आते हैं. तो उनके साथ रहने वाली महिलाएं नेचुरली वो बहुत ही विदुषी रही ही होंगी.
आप एक और बार बोलेंगे?
विश्व में 6 दर्शन हैं जिसमें 4 मिथिला ने दिया है.
There are
फिलॉसफी
अच्छा,
फिलॉसफी या
जी जी. So in the world, right?
हाँ.
विश्व में 6 में 4 मिथिला.
4 मिथिला
So in the world of 6 philosophies, 4 were based in Mithila.
या
हाँ.
4 from Mithila. Yeah. The philosophers. Yeah.
4 key
Yeah.
philosophers, yes.
उनके साथ रहने वाली महिलाएं नेचुरली गंवार तो नहीं होंगी.
So the women who lived with these philosophers were obviously also highly educated.
या तो जब हमें आप किसी चीज़ को अगर बहुत ही पावरफुल चीज़ है उसको आप घर में बंद कर दोगे तो वो एनर्जी कहीं ना कहीं जाएगा ही. तो वहाँ हमारी महिलाओं को जब बंद कर दिया गया तो उनके अंदर जो भी थी, जो भी उनकी प्रतिभा थी, जो भी टैलेंट था, उनको उन्होंने try again, I'm trying to. She got only 2 canvas. One canvas from the father's home and second husband's home. But on the only the 2 walls, she created a magical artwork because there her all suppressed desires, they discharged their all desires on their wall. वो उड़ना चाहती थी. If she wants to fly, they want to fly with color, with brush, with pen. They. अब बताते हैं कन्या हूँ मत करूँ. उनके अंदर जो एक समय आया जब बाल विधवाएं ज़्यादा होने लगी, तो आदमी है, आदमी की बहुत सारी इच्छाएं हैं. अकॉर्डिंग फ्राइड, वो कहता है, फ्राइड का मनोविज्ञान कहता है कि इच्छाएं मरती नहीं हैं. अगर हमारे अंदर कुछ है तो कॉन्शस से उसको सब कॉन्शस में डाल दिया जाता है, लेकिन वो कहीं ना कहीं तो निकलती. तो उनको सारी जो उनकी दबी हुई इच्छाएं थी उनको उन्होंने वहाँ दिखाया. आप देखिएगा कि एक फ्रीडम है पेंटिंग में, एक उड़ान है. बता.
So that, you know, there were a lot of child widows during this time too,
Yeah.
and whose desires were repressed. So it kind of became like the space, the canvas for that expression of that kind of repressed desire. And then she drew a connection with Freud there.
Yeah. उड़ान है.
And then that, you know, it was about flying. And so before this, just as she was saying, that therefore the colors were so vibrant. She did say that in, you know, when she came into my class the other day too, that part of the reason the colors were so vibrant was because it was a mapping of the women's desires to fly, to have that kind of colorful life on the walls. Yeah.
Child widows are not permitted to पहनना jewelry, a colorful dress, but each one want to live colorful life. So they expressed her whole desires, the weaknesses of colors on wall. So you can see the previous paintings, 2 bright colors. Which is that? The expression of desires. So the women of Mithila, महिलाओं ने अपने को व्यस्त रखने के लिए, ये इनका सवाल था कि क्यों महिलाएं ही इसको करती. हाँ, तो अपने को कहीं गलत रास्ते पर नहीं ले जा करके अपनी सारी इच्छाओं को उन्होंने पॉजिटिव तरीके से कला की तरफ मोड़ दिया. बता दीजिए.
So she's saying it was that the women decided to turn all their desires into this creative art so that they wouldn't, you know, go astray. So.
हाँ, और उन्होंने बाजार के लिए उन्हें परमिशन नहीं था जाने का, तो उन्होंने किचन गार्डन से रंग लिया.
So they didn't have permission to actually go and buy colors from the markets and so on and so forth. So they made colors from the kitchen gardens, from the...
Yeah, and kitchen.
All natural color.
Natural. That,
yeah, all that natural colors
color.
from the...
green from green leaves, blue from Aparajita flower, red from vermilion, yellow from turmeric, and so many seeds also, so many flowers. So this is only, I think this is the first art which is preserved by only women.
लेकिन आजकल आदमी भी ये काम करते हैं तो
Yes.
क्या तोहफत
Yes.
क्या
Yes.
परिवर्तन हुआ
या जी जी जी, ये
बताइए।
आपका कहना सही है, अब लोग आ रहे हैं. The men are also following me.
Women's lib.
Yes.
But her question, Sue's question, was about
wall and the floor.
painting inside, right?
The wall
Versus
and the
painting,
floor and a
yeah.
canvas.
I thought what she was saying was, I heard her say this before. I thought it's exactly what you were saying when you doing pattern.
Yes.
Yeah. Wall to canvas. Over here.
We'll come back to.
I have it may be a long question, but it's a very basic one. To perhaps Rani Jha and Parmeshwar Jha as well, about how do you teach Mithila painting at the Art Institute? What do you see as the basic components that need to be taught? I mean, we have a sense of how it's done for Western art. You know, you start with perspective and, you know, anatomy, things like that. What are the basic building blocks for you? Or is it more a question of basically giving people the materials and the space and time and asking them to get on with it? Because clearly it's also a very personal practice. And जैसे आप कह रही थी, कल्पना की उड़ान होती है इसमें. तो, I mean, how do you allow that to happen while also teaching?
You know, it is in 2000 we realized that painting is not flying. You know, that painting is not, our painters are becoming old, and the name and fame, those who brought this painting, you know, all top painters, 5, 6 painters, you know, they were old, and good paintings were not coming, you know, from the people. So in 2000, our friend Raymond died, and we decided to start a Mithila Art Institute. You know, at that time, we hired a person who has been trained in art. Actually, it was EAF money. Ethnic Art Foundation supported him to send it to Baroda School of Art. It is a famous school of art in India. He was trained in fine art, not in Mithila art. So we asked him, will you join Mithila Art Institute? He said that I am in Madhubani, I am not going anywhere, I am not painting these days. And he was, you know, 50% whether he should go to Delhi or somewhere else. But he decided to be here. So he developed a curriculum. In that curriculum, his name is Santosh Kumar Das. He is a famous painter. He is a very good painter. He developed a curriculum. You know, that anatomy, as you said, you know, first 6 months, we trained them, actually not myself, Rani and Dulari, they trained them in, you know, iconography, you know, that the lines, you know, anatomy, all these things. They spent 6 months, every day, 5 days in a week, and they spend in our institute. They must come. That competition is itself a very tough one. Generally, more than 200, you know, 300 to 400 students appear in the test. We give them Rani Jha and others. They give some subjects. They paint for 4 hours. And then immediately just after that, and it was a blind, as Peter said, it is a blind competition. Somebody will go, took their name, give a roll number, sit in the room, you know, then paint. And after we have always a committee just after that. You know, that committee will sit and select 30 to 40 best paintings. So they select 30 students. And then they interview their attitude, approach, whether they want to stay, they want to spend 4 hours every day or not, you know. So they interview and then selected 30 students. That 30 students, they come every day, 5 days in a week. You know, they learn from them, you know, that curriculum is there, and they follow them, you know, Mithila motif, outline. Every painting you see the outline, you know, that they practice. And then after that, after 6 months, they have a freedom. They can do whatever they want to do it. And most talented students we select after 1 year. Perhaps out of 30, we select 7, 8 students, most talented students, to go to second year. This is our usual procedure. We want to change. We want to introduce some of, I was discussing with Peter and with other people too. I would like to have this audience, you know, if you can suggest something what we should do to improve the quality. We want to compete in the world. You know, we do not want to just Ethnic Art Foundation started this institution, not for fun's sake. And we have seen the results. You have seen some of our students painting here, you know, that they are good, very good, and they are competitive. And that is the way we are doing it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Peter mentioned that in David's paper that Ray Owens was paying 30 times the market rate for the paintings then.
Yeah.
And I heard him say this himself once when he gave a talk about 27, 8 years ago. You were there. I mean, what kind of effect that must have had a huge impact on the local economy.
Yeah.
Because I see this in the Portua Para as well. Certain people benefit from that, but others are left behind. And it must have created a strong sense of competition and jealousy amongst the people in the village.
Yes.
So how did that unfold and then resolve itself over time?
I said several times to David, Peter, and everybody, you know, in the audience, to all these people, we want to promote painting, Mithila painting. That is our commitment. We are not there for social reform or employment. We are not giving employment. You know, that is not our motto. We want to promote best painting. That is our main motto. You know, to produce good painting and the paintings which we can market in the world. You know, people will feel proud that my painting is in Syracuse Museum or say London Museum. That kind of thing, that commitment is there. So we are selecting best people, we train them, and we tell them, produce the best, whatever you can do it. And we are ready to pay any money, the market value. You are right, you know, that in the beginning.
EAF.
Yeah, before that. When Ray started, Ray had that mission. At that time, I actually joined with an Ethnic Art Foundation in 1983. Before that, Ray was in Madhubani. He spent 3 years in Madhubani. He was a professor, and he spent there. What he was doing also, that he will select and ask them, rather he was commissioning sometimes. You produce the best and I will pay maximum. That was his philosophy too. You know, at that time, you know, some of them, you might remember, the painting's price was 10 rupees, 15 rupees, 20 rupees. And he was willing to pay 100 rupees, 50 rupees, 60 rupees. But he was demanding the best. He will say, yeah, you are a good artist, I understand that. But you will have to produce best and I will pay. And he did. You know, that has created an environment. You know, we are we are in the business of promoting Mithila painting. You know, and our mission is to produce best and sell best paintings. That is.
We'll take one more question. Perhaps
Well, actually, Dr. Banerjee.
Okay, Paula Hanley to finish with Chandra, and we can continue the conversation over chai and dinner, etc.
Yeah.
So we'll go with Paula, and then we'll end.
My question is, I'm glad, Frank, you asked this question because it's sort of related. It's with this whole idea about commodification, and I'll ask it to Pika because you talked about embroidery, which is very labor intensive. And whenever we see that kind of embroidery work, whether it's Lucknow chicken or katha or zari embroidery today, most of the time the embroidery workers are women. And so you talk about in your katha, a women's world, but that world is also very structured. They couldn't think up a theme. You know, they couldn't be autonomous in that. There was a theme, there were certain given themes in which they could give in their inputs. You know, they could sort of subvert, become subversive. Now, you know, that is a certain kind of limited autonomy. Now, today, when a katha is very much a commodity and a woman is a laborer, so would you say in terms of quotient of autonomy, their autonomy has increased with the capital, or their autonomy has decreased from the ones that you were dealing with?
That's an interesting question. I'm sure the stuff produced today is speaking to its market, right? An aesthetic, which has a lot to do with politics, economics, class, etc. But it's hard for me to believe that some of those things did not exist in 19th century early kathas, you know.
You mean like pillow covers and things? Pillow covers and things like that?
Yeah. Because we...
The audience was different, but it was still a
No, but a shadi made today or a lipstick case or a sunglass case is for a purpose, and its physical dimensions are constraints. Its material offers particular constraints, right? Because you're not exactly pulling, partola is not happening anymore. And in the same way, I think those older kanthas had their particular limitations. There are specific dyes. I mean, there are structures, they're just different. And, you know, I don't know that commodification has, I haven't thought this through, but that the pace has gone up so fast. I think we see it much faster, and that's why it's flashed that slide quickly. We see that much quicker because we recognize it. But we don't know those conditions in the 19th century as intimately. I mean, I think there are kanthas talking specifically back to Hutum Panchar Naksha, for example. Particular, very popular sets of narratives, satires, visions floating in that world that was, I mean, I'm feeling very uncomfortable, but I have found a motif that I can trace back to a Hogarth print. So these things are circulating wildly, and the constraints are very, very global, actually. And then there's a long history, if we tie these back to the Portuguese cultures, where particular prints are being sent to Bengal to be stitched and sent back for elite residence or even church, you know. So that's just by example to suggest, I think we kind of underestimate the cosmopolitanism of the worlds before and the global, you know, whatever. We think of ourselves as this global moment, but my first graduate seminar taught me Mohenjo-daro was as global as anybody else.
I have a question for Rani ji. That you're now teaching in this new context where you are focusing in at the institute on the best, right? What happens to those who are not the best? And because the origins of this tradition was, you were talking about women expressing themselves within the home, and then they come out and they start doing it outside, and that's dying out. So you're trying to revive it. Are there women who are not as technically, savvy or good, who are still doing this kind of painting at home? And is there an interest in, and if there's not, how do you propose as an institute to address that?
Actually, I think painting is part of literature, okay? हर इतिहास की अपनी कला है, अपना साहित्य है, जैसे सब कुछ है, तो वो कला उस समय को दिखाता है, ठीक है? आप हिंदी समझते हैं? Yeah.
That every art form and literature has a context,
Yes.
and it reflects, it has a history, and it
मैं
reflects that time.
आप ही की बात पे आ रही हूँ। तो जो नहीं बना सकती हैं, तो ट्रेडिशनल भी बहुत ही चलता है। हाँ, और दूसरी बात ये है, एक होपफुली हम आपको कहेंगे कि अभी नए जनरेशन की लड़कियां इसमें आ रही हैं, ऑलमोस्ट वो पढ़ी हुई है, पढ़ी लिखी हैं, तो या और मैं उनसे कहती हूँ कि तुम ट्रेडिशनल भी बनाओ, ट्रेडिशनल या, लेकिन अगर तुम्हें कुछ लगता है कि समाज में जो कुछ हो रहा है अच्छा है बुरा है, तो अगर तुमको जैसा अनुभव होता है तुम बना सकती हो। ताकि
So it's still an expressive sort of tradition where women are talking about their issues.
Yeah. तो ट्रेडिशन
give you the background. The painting, painting family has increased a lot. In 70s when he was referring that there was a drought, and at that time government of India started promoting it. There were only few painters. Nowadays, near about 1,000 family, they are painting. Families. I am not talking about the whole family, 4, 5 people, everybody is painting that. So it has increased. In last 10 years, perhaps it has increased from 400 to 1,000 or something like that. No, I don't know exactly. There is no figure around here, but it has increased. Painting, the theme has changed. As Rani was telling, the theme has changed. We identified long back, before 2000 or immediately after 2000, that traditional theme will not fly a lot.
And I really, truly appreciate what you're doing with that, and I don't think that a tradition should be tradition bound. Change is...
we have maintained
But my
the
question
core.
was for what about those who are not good enough to make the cut?
They are making it. They are making it. They are, perhaps it's
I have a couple of thoughts about that. There's some of the families he's talking about are factories, and they're making really awful stuff. And a couple years ago, or 2 years ago, I found that Crate and Barrel had a painting by one of the Dusad painters. It was the most god-awful thing you can ever imagine. I actually got it off my computer before they took it down off the website.
I think women in the past, when they were making inside their homes, they could have made something really awful, and it doesn't matter.
Right. No. I'm trying to talk to your question. We had an intern at the Institute over the summer, and she did a questionnaire with the students, and over half of them wanted to go into commerce. They had no interest in staying in art. So some of them are going, those that are good are going on with painting, but there's a lot of painters out there painting that some of who've gone through the Institute and some have not, who are not very good, who are selling it in Delhi Hut for whatever they can get it for. I mean, the people that are selling here are not the kids that are selling in Delhi Hut.
Right.
And there's guys from some of these communities that go around and collect the paintings and take them to Delhi and sell them for 20 or 30, $10 or whatever they can get.
No, me first.
Can I just?
I want to speak.
Can I just add in one more question to end that? Because it was just a really interesting moment there, which was about what is quality.
Yeah.
And I wanted to end it with thinking about that because, Chandra, you just said nobody cared about who was painting what, but Pika, you talked about your mother making the really fine alpana and people noticing that and inviting her into the wedding, and I just wanted to leave people with those wonderful thoughts. Yeah, so quality is not something new.
Potency as opposed to aesthetic beauty, you know. And my question, my turn, is, you know, when we're saying the numbers have gone up so much, are we seeing some, I mean, is it not, maybe this is not the right way to think about it, but when you're thinking of a kobar ghar inside a home and a family of women and friends painting, that's a totally different situation than saying the numbers are rising when we're shifting to cheaper and cheaper paper and the markets are getting bigger and bigger and the money is flowing in, no?
Yeah.
I mean, these are all interrelated processes, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to some extent, the shift in medium allows for proliferation in a way. I mean, material matters so much. I keep going back to that.
I will give you one example. One of our students, she was not making a lot of money because her painting was mediocre and she attended only 1 year and she could not make, and her painting was. So what she did, she decided to do 5 paintings a day and she decreased the cost. You know, she was not selling it in 1,000. She was selling in 200, 100. You know, and in that way, she attracted middleman from Delhi, and she was affluent. She became affluent.
But you know, to add to that, that what she did was a micro version of what perhaps we might be doing here too, right?
Yeah.
In terms of how these ideas about commodification and market and what kinds of bodies have access to which is being reproduced.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. We are not in the business of marketing. First, you know that we want to produce. Yeah, we want to produce good painters, good painting, which has a market.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Yeah, right.
There is difference between artist and artisan.
What will be the price? Yes.
सर हम आर्टिस्ट हमारे इंस्टीट्यूट में मिथिला आर्ट इंस्टीट्यूट में हम पहले आर्टिस्ट तैयार करते हैं.
So in the case of the porto, as I was discussing, it's not just the painting, but also the performative tradition, the songs. And the way they judge a good porto from a bad porto is whether they're competent in both. So Dukusham, the guru, would say that if you can paint, but you can't sing, then you're not a portois, right? Or if you can sing, but you can't paint, then you're not a portois. It's the bringing of the two together into a performative action that makes it what it is and what makes it good art, right? And so he thinks that's declining, despite the fact that the numbers are going up for what Pika said, due to commodification and more demand, they have to supply for that demand. So you have more scrolls being produced, the quality goes down, but they're not learning the songs or composing new songs to go along with it. So it's a give and take.
But in a performative tradition, it's different. There are many pieces where the judgment.
Okay. We filmed it, you know, the difference of how